And welcome back, everybody, to another conversation today. And again, February 7th, a quarter of the way through the month. And it seems like this year's going by a little bit faster than, I guess, each year as it advances feels that way. Don't know why. But we are here with Philip Fracassi. I hope I said that right.
Yeah.
And he's a script and novelist, and we're going to talk about some of his stuff today. And he's multi-genre, but main focus is horror, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
So, Philip, what got you started?
Oh God, it's a long-winded answer potentially, but I've been writing since I was, like many writers, I've been writing since I was a little kid. It's always been, my dream to be a horror writer, or to be a professional writer, I should say, a published author. And ever since I was reading books as a little kid and looking at the author photos on the back jacket was, Stephen King sitting at his desk or whatever, and I always be like, man, I hope that could be me one day. And so it's always been a lifelong dream, and I've been writing my whole life. I actually started writing, when I was older. I was writing, my focus was mainly literary fiction, meaning non-genre fiction. So I wrote a few novels. I wrote a bunch of short stories. I tried very hard to get published. I tried very hard to get an agent, and really never was able to break in. So I started screenwriting, and I did that for a while. This is around a little over 10 years ago, and had some success there. Had a couple movies produced. And then just really about 6-7 years ago, I decided to take a crack at genre fiction. And I wrote a horror story called Mother, and sent it out to one publisher who bought it within literally, I think it was a couple hours, and sent them another story called Alter a few months later, which they immediately bought. And Alter became kind of a little cult hit, like underground hit sort of thing, where a lot of the horror community was getting excited about it, reading it and talking about it. But so there was some buzz. And meanwhile, I was writing more short stories in that same genre. And then based on the strength of really just those two chapbooks, I got an offer from a publisher to do a story collection. And it just kind of has been going nonstop since then. And now I have, a lot of books out, and got a lot of books coming up. So, and finally broke through with my first Big 5 publishing deal just earlier this year, which is very exciting. So it's been a great ride, and I feel very fortunate,
Well, let's talk a little bit about the screenwriting versus novel writing, because I know that's a huge difference. And I think a lot of people would like to hear about that, because I know some people write their stories as books, but then they say, well, I think this might make a good movie, but turning it into a script is pretty hard, I would say, for me anyway.
Yeah. I mean, so screenwriting is essentially, it's very different, and we'll get into a couple of differences, but the main difference is you approach it very differently. And what I mean by that is, when you are writing a screenplay, you are creating a story, but you're not creating something. You're not creating a piece of art. Okay. For lack of a better way to put it, you're creating a structure. You're creating a foundation for which other people to build a movie upon. It's very technical. It's very driven by timing of the scenes. It's driven by the action. So it's really more about dialogue and action, dialogue, action, dialogue, action. That's really all you do. You're not describing the trees. You're not describing the sunset. You're only talking about what people look like and what they're wearing as it pertains to costuming. And those are probably likely going to get tossed out anyway. So really, it's just about like, here's the dialogue, here's the action, and here's the way the movie plays out. So I think, whereas when you approach a story or a novel, you're really, yes, you have the story and you have the characters, but you're talking about a lot of the inner dialogue the characters have, a lot of their thoughts and feelings the characters are, having, their history. The prose is obviously richer. You're describing things. You're getting more into like how everything looks. You have to give the reader enough to visualize what's happening. I mean, it's the same thing with screenwriting too. And I think some of that carries over. I've been asked a lot of times, has my screenwriting influenced my fiction writing? And I think in two ways it has. One is screenwriting. It's very, like I said, it's very structured. It's very technical. So the way you tell a story is kind of, it's more of a, there's no other way to put it. It's more technical than in a novel, where a lot of times it can be stream of consciousness almost, where you just kind of like follow the characters to see where it goes. I don't personally work that way. I kind of carry that structured way of telling a story over to my fiction. So my stories tend to have 3-act structure. I line out my beats ahead of time for each, for each story. My novels are intensively outlined before I begin actually writing them, which is very different than a lot of writers work. So some of that stuff carries over. But I also think that because I wrote so many screenplays, part of writing a screenplay is you have to give enough for the director or the production designer or the producer to visualize what's happening, where it's happening. And you can say things like exterior junkyard, morning, dilapidated, junkyard filled with junk, and that could be enough. But if you want to if it pertains to the story, you maybe have to get a little bit more visual with that. So some of that I think carries over into how I tell a story. I'm very focused on visuals. I'm very focused on physicality of action. So my stories are very visceral, but I'm also very focused on the prose being very punchy, very crunchy. I want people to enjoy reading the stories. And they move cinematically. There's no real technical way to describe that, other than my novels tend to play out a bit more cinematically than some writers who, I think just they have a different style where it's just more about, I think some writers, their novel is sort of a pure form, and it's sort of its own standalone thing as to how it is delivered to a reader's brain. Whereas I think my stuff is kind of more, like I said, it's more cinematic, it's more visual, it's a little more beat plot based. So anyway, so that's kind of the thing. But there's a lot of different. It's two completely different approaches. When I wrote a screenplay for Lifetime, I wrote a Lifetime movie called Girl Missing, and I think from the first draft to the actual shooting draft, I think I counted 26 drafts. And you have directors giving you feedback. You have producers giving you feedback. You have the production designer giving you feedback. You have actors giving you feedback. When you're on a location, you'll go out there and maybe there'll be like a unique facet to the house that you're filming at. And the director will want to work in that unique facet into the script. So I was on set for a month in Minnesota in the dead of winter. And every day I was rewriting pages for different reasons. So it's very fluid. It's very much a group effort. Whereas writing a story or a novel, it's all about the author, and the editor has suggestions and the proofreader has fixes. But the story and the prose in the story is sort of sacred ground and I'm the only one who can touch it.
Now, going with that, before we get into some of your books, what is it like? I mean, because you actually, isn't there a time constraint also, which each scene has to only be so long?
In screenwriting, to a degree, yeah, to a degree, you definitely can't have 20-minute scenes, unless it's so there's what we call set pieces. So where you'll have a set piece is basically an action sequence. So you'll have sometimes those go a little long, like it's a supermarket scene where a polar bear is running through the supermarket, and chaos ensues. Those can be a little long. But yeah, if you're talking about a dialogue driven scene in a standard movie, yeah, you got to be brief. You got to get the point across quickly and move on, because you only have 88 minutes or whatever to get your whole movie in, so you can't mess around.
So that is definitely a big difference between the novels and the.
Yeah. Nobody wants to read a book where nothing happens for 50 pages though either, right? So it's kind of there are similarities in that sense, but to your point, I can go more than 88 pages in my novels, and or whatever. So yeah, and I've proved that because my book Child Among Strangers is 600 pages. That came out last October. So, but yeah, so, and that's why a lot of times you'll see, when you see adaptations, when people make a movie out of a novel, a lot of people are like, oh, they really had to pick and choose what to tell, what parts of that story to tell, because even a short novel, there's so much content that if you were to transfer that all to a screenplay or a film adaptation, you'd be talking about an 8-hour movie, which is why a lot of times you're seeing nowadays there's a lot more mini series or Netflix 8-episode arcs, where it's more like one season of TV versus like a 2-hour movie, because that way they can get the whole story in without having to cut a lot of what they feel might be valid to have in the movie version.
That's actually good information to know. So if people are trying to do something, then they can try to adapt that way.
Yeah, I mean, I've adapted my own work for production companies, not novel, but I adapted a couple short stories, and it's different because when you adapt a short story, you have to expand. You have to find a way to fill 2 hours, right? Because unless it's a novella length story, but a traditional short story, call it 5,000 to 7,500 words, that's like an episode. I mean, that's like a creep show. That's like a 30-minute episode. So sometimes you have to really figure out different ways to flesh it out. But what's interesting is, the reason that a lot of these producers or production companies don't hire the writer of the story to tell the screenplay version is for two reasons. One, because a lot of writers can't write screenplays well, a lot of fiction writers. But the other is that a lot of times they want like they want like the hook. They want the acorn of the story, but they don't want the whole story from A to Z. They just kind of want the hook and maybe a couple of the characters. But the reason they hire different writers, and I've learned this lesson a little bit the hard way, is that when I write a short story, if the story is about a little girl who goes to visit her grandmother's house in the woods and gets eaten by a wolf, I only have one way to tell that story, and that's my way. So that's the way that story translates to me is told like this. And then what they do is they say, well, okay, we want you to write the screenplay, but we want you to write it completely differently, but using the same idea. It's like, well, I can't do that because I already wrote my version of that story, and that's it. Like, so you should hire a different writer who will take the same idea and write it a different way, if you want something different. Because asking me to do something, it's like asking me to wear the wrong size shoe. It's like, it's not going to fit. So it's an interesting process. But yeah, I've had one of my novels was recently in the process. It was adapted into a TV series. They're shopping it, trying to sell it right now to a producer, but that's going to be like an 8-episode arc. So yeah, so it's an interesting field. I much prefer writing fiction than screenplays. Screenwriting it's not, I don't mind collaborating, but I do mind rewriting a story that I've already written based on other people's input ideas. After a while, that gets old. After a while, that gets tedious, and especially when you're doing it again and again, and you're doing it for 6 months or 7 months, and it's just like, okay, guys, let's fish or cut bait here. So I much prefer to write the fiction and let somebody else do the adaptations if I had my my choice.
Well, now let's get to some of your books, because I know you have a couple of awards for best collection, actually.
Yeah. So I've been publishing, like I said, for about 7 years now, I guess. My first story was published in 2015. My first collection came out in 2017, and it won a This Is Horror award for best story collection. And then I had a second story collection called Beneath the Pale Sky that came out in 2021, I think, and that was named Best Story Collection of the Year by Rue Morgue magazine, which is like a big international horror magazine. And it was also nominated for a Bram Stoker award, and it's also nominated for a This Is Horror award. But then I started really about 3 years ago. I decided to start to focus less on writing short stories and focus more on writing novels. I'd gone through a couple agents at that point. I wasn't really finding my footing with the agents I was working with. So I kind of parted ways with both of those agents, and then spent like 6 months writing this 600-page novel called The Child Alone with Strangers, and sent that to an agent. And she immediately wanted to represent it. And now we've been with the same agent now for over 3 years, and she's great. So she's done a really good job of helping me kind of build out my career. So I've been writing novels ever since then. I've been publishing a lot of novels. So I had last year, I had a children's book come out. I had a book of poetry come out, and then I had a non-genre novel come out called Don't Let Them Get You Down, which is sort of like a novel about like depression and anxiety. And that was sort of like, those were all like smaller presses. But then I had A Child Alone with Strangers come out with Taylor's Press. This is what that book looks like. If you can see it, it's a nice big fat brick, 600-page crime and horror hybrid. And then that came out at the end of last year. And then in February of this year, Gothic came out, which is a horror novel that came out from Cemetery Dance. Very scary, much different vibe. And then in July, so based on sort of the strength of these books, kind of early buzz. And then I also had back in February, so I wrote a book called Boys in the Valley, and it came out at the end of 2021, and it was a limited edition. There were only 500 copies made. And my agent was kind of like, I don't know if this is mainstream. It's pretty dark. And I said, okay. So I sold it to this this kind of deluxe edition press called Earthling, and they did 500 copies, and one of those copies went to a reviewer named Sadie Hartman, who wrote a review for it on Twitter. And then the next day, Stephen King retweeted her review of my book with a picture of my book saying, I'm going to buy it. So while that sounds really great, and it was, when Stephen King tweets about your book, you want people to be able to buy that book. And this book had been sold out for like months at that point. So there was like this feeding frenzy online where I was getting all these messages and emails and angry people, coming at me, and very nice people coming at me as well, wanting this book that they couldn't buy. And it was a very bittersweet day for me, or week, I should say, because I spent most of my week responding to people on Twitter. I mean, Stephen King has 6 million followers. I mean, it was thousands of messages, and literally they couldn't buy the book. So it was very frustrating in that sense. The positive side of it is we were able to leverage that momentum, and I was able to sign a 2-book deal with Macmillan, a Macmillan imprint named Tor Nightfire. So they're putting the book out this July, and then I have a second book coming out from them in June of 2024 that I'm writing right now called Brothers. So that was the positive that came out of it. But yeah, so it's been kind of an interesting journey. So now I'm kind of really focused on just writing novels, but I probably write like now, where I think maybe like in 2017, 2018, I was writing like, 10 short stories a year. Now I'm really writing a novel and a half to 2 novels a year, and maybe trying to fit in like 2 or 3 short stories somewhere in there. So that's kind of the new model for sustaining a career, because you just can't look, short stories are great and they're wonderful. But you're talking about, hundreds of dollars if you're lucky for a short story. Whereas novels, you're talking about, enough money to you can do it for a living. So 2 very different ways to spend your time. But the positive side of writing short stories for writers who might be listening is that they're easier to, if you can find the right person to represent you, they're easier to sell for adaptation than novels, because a lot of production studios prefer just to have the hook, the little idea that they can then go hire a screenwriter to flesh out, versus buying a novel and then they got to read the whole novel, which sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's a facet of it. And then they got to it's much more of a thing. So they prefer just to spend a little bit of money, own that idea, and then hire their own writers to write it and stuff like that. So I've done very well optioning short stories. I think I've optioned 5 in the last few years, and what just and one of my 4 novels. So in that sense, it can make sense to do it from a business perspective, but that's a much harder. It's a much harder thing to count on,
Yes. Now, where can people find you at?
Man, I'm everywhere, Greg. I'm you can find me. My website is, because you gotta be right. My website is pfracassi.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I don't have any weird, funny names. It's just Philip Fracassi, very easy to find. I'm on Instagram at pfracassi. I'm on TikTok, talking about my books. And there's a fun fan group on Facebook called Fracassi Freaks, that some of my readers created about a year ago. That's been growing really fast. So I think we just broke 400 members. So that's a place I like to go and hang out, and I kind of give those guys exclusives and early cover reveals and stuff like that. And it's a lot of fun.
Now, when they go to your website, can they ask for a signed copy or purchase a signed copy?
What I have in my, yes. So on my website, all my books are listed, all my stories are listed. There's contact info for me, so you can email me through my website. And I do have a page I just created where I'll ship out free book plates for any. So I have these, I create my own book plates, for different books. Like this is the one for Gothic.
Cool.
So I try and make them all sort of, graphically tied into the covers. And you can order a book plate through the website. I stopped doing signed books through my website, to be honest with you, because I couldn't keep up, and I don't have enough stock here in my office. It became too time consuming and having to keep buying new stock from the publishers and stuff. So now I just kind of send it. There's a website called vjbooks.com. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but they only sell signed first editions. So they carry most of my books, and they sell signed editions directly.
Sweet. So everyone, we will be back on Thursday with another conversation, and we have the Con Hour on Thursday night at 6 p.m. Definitely you want to watch that one. That's going to be a great show. But until our next show, everyone, and